Okay, you will notice in the little corner, as we decided a year ago, we are recording, and Talmud class gets posted online, so everybody please be on their best behavior.
Okay.
Now, if I recall correctly, we finished a chapter when last we met.
I have a note 46b. We started, I think we left off at 46b, started at 46b, something 46b.
46b.
Yeah.
We did not finish a chapter. Huh. I thought we had finished 6, but if it's 46b, there's a lot of work to go. And it looks like,
When we see it, we'll know it.
well, that unfortunately doesn't work for me because everything is familiar to me. So
Yeah, but not
I
to
could be-
us.
okay, so I could be teaching for a half an hour and not know that I already taught it to you. So did we do like graves and bones and stuff like that?
Doesn't sound familiar.
Okay.
We did burying people. I
Yeah,
think.
well, we're getting into that now. Okay, so let's just look at 46a, where the Mishnah is about quarters down the page, 46a-3. Does everyone want to find their own Talmud online, or do you want me to be screen sharing and putting it up for you?
Screen
Screen share.
sharing.
Screen share, yeah.
Okay, so let me do that.
By the way, Rabbi, if you want to switch your class to the regular synagogue login, you could do that.
I'm not opposed.
I mean, that's where Stu went also, but it didn't work initially, right?
No. Probably be doing,
I'll talk to Gary. If we're going to do that, we need to do it at a time when we change the publicity.
leaving it alone would be fine, but whatever you think is best.
Well, you all managed to get here today, so if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Okay.
46a, Sanhedrin, skimming for the Mishnah.
Hannah. Hi, Hannah.
Good morning. How are you?
Okay.
I did not know if I'm in or out.
You're in.
I'm in. How are you? Good morning.
Good morning.
More
Is the rabbi giving a
actually not morning, is it? It's afternoon now.
Right.
Good
it's really
afternoon?
Yeah. The
Sorry
rabbi's-
about the,
He's looking for the proper document to put on the screen. So we can talk among ourselves while he works.
Here we go.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to get a running start here at this so we can remind ourselves of the topic. Since I have a little food to eat here, maybe I can have a volunteer to read the Mishnah.
Okay. Watch
Go
your
ahead,
things
Vanna.
change. Mishnah, how do they hang the corpse of one who was put to death by stoning? They sink a post into the earth with a piece of wood jutting out, forming a T-shaped structure. And the court appointee then places the dead man's two hands, one upon the other, ties them, and hangs him by his hands. Rabbi Yosef says the post is not sunk into the ground, rather it leans against a wall, and he hangs the corpse on it the way that butchers do with meat.
I think we've done this before.
Yes, we have.
This is review.
Okay.
The dead man hangs there for only a short time, and then they immediately untie him. And if he was left hanging overnight, a prohibition is transgressed, as it is stated, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall bury him that day, for he that is hung is a curse of God. That is to say, were the corpse left hanging on the tree overnight, people would ask, for what reason was this one hung after he was put to death? They would be answered, because he blessed God, a euphemism for blasphemy. And therefore the name of heaven would be desecrated were the dead man's corpse to remain hanging, reminding everybody of his transgression.
Okay, so you don't leave him hanging up there so long because people will say, hey, why is that guy hanging up there? And people will say, because he said X, Y, and Z. And in saying that, they will say the things that he was killed for. So now they are also supposed to be killed. So we don't want that to happen. So we don't leave him hanging up there. Okay?
Got it.
Go on. Still in the Mishnah.
Rabbi Meir said the phrase for he that is hung is a curse of God should be understood as follows. When a man suffers in the wake of his sin, what expression does the divine presence use? I am distressed about my head. I am distressed about my arm, meaning I too suffer when the wicked are punished. From here it is derived. If God suffers such distress over the blood of the wicked that is spilled, even though they justly deserve their punishment, it can be inferred a fortiori that he suffers distress over the blood of the righteous.
Okay? So God has empathetic suffering. God has empathy, feels the feelings of even the sinner being executed. And so how much the more so if it's not a sinner who is suffering. Okay? This is here, however, as part of the conversation about whether or not you leave the executed guy up there or not. Go on.
And the sages said not only this, but that an executed transgressor must be buried on the same day that he is killed. But they said that anyone who leaves his deceased relative overnight without burying him transgresses a prohibition. But if he left the deceased overnight for the sake of the deceased's honor, that is to bring a coffin or shrouds for his burial, he does not transgress the prohibition against leaving him unburied overnight.
Okay. And we discussed that in terms of our traditions, that, you know, very often we leave somebody overnight one night because we're preparing a funeral, even two, if necessary, three, because of the honor of that person. We're bringing in family or a great rabbi or someone to speak or something like that. But basically, you don't say, you know what, it's only my mother. We'll get around to it next Tuesday. Right? That you can't do. All right, go on.
After the executed transgressor is taken down, he is buried, and they would not bury him in his ancestral burial plot. Rather, two graveyards were established for the burial of those executed by the court, one for those who were killed by decapitation or strangled, and one for those who were stoned or burned. Once the flesh of the deceased had decomposed, they would gather his bones and bury them in their proper place in his ancestral burial plot. And soon after the execution, the relatives of the executed transgressor would come and inquire about the welfare of the judges and about the welfare of the witnesses, as if to say, we hold no grudges against you, as you judged a true judgment.
Okay. All right. Any questions about the process that you've been shown here?
This was really a pressing problem in those days?
Only when it happened. I don't think that they were dealing with thousands of criminals and multiple cemeteries and all that stuff, but it has to come from somewhere. And up north, those of you who traveled with me to Israel last time, when we went to all the synagogues and all the mosaics and all the ruins that we've seen, we'll recall we also went to the burial place in Beit Sharim up north with the caves and the stone boxes and things like that. And it's very clear that the rabbis of the Mishnah in the northern part of the land of Israel had were in a culture of elaborate burial practices. And there was a burial industry, just like there is today, with funeral homes and coffins and shrouds and resting places and purchasing a plot and all of those kinds of things. And there were families who, if their loved one had been executed by the court, would have come and wanted to take care of their loved one. And the court, part of the execution is you will not be buried in that family plot at, think of Beit Sharim, how large and how expansive that place was. It was obviously a very, that's like, I don't know, think of some really large cemetery where A lot of important people are buried. We don't want the criminals buried in there. We take the bones to the criminal plot, take the body to the criminal plot, and when only the bones are left, you can put them in an ossuary, and then the ossuary box for the bones can be brought over here to the final resting place. But not at the beginning, not when the person is still a body, not when the criminal still looks like the criminal. Okay? And then the relatives would come after execution, and they would pay respect to the judges in the court. Right? And that was important so that nobody thought anyone was holding a grudge against the court. You know, it's interesting. We have this horrible case in the last couple of months of the federal judge who's, you know, was attacked. Her family was killed in her home in Los Angeles, right? Or wherever that was.
No, it's in Esther Salas in New Jersey. Her husband was shot and her son was killed.
New Jersey then. Yes, that's a horrible case where somebody has clearly held a grudge against her. Person evidently was also, you know, against women in positions of power and all kinds of things. But the idea that you would go after the judge because of the ruling that the judge ruled is completely contrary to the system of ethics and morals in the Mishnah. The law is from God, and the people who administer the law, even though they're interpreting and applying, it's the law that you would be insulting, not the judge. Right? Okay. Did we do the Gemara? And the relatives would not mourn him in advance? Did we do this?
I know we talked about that you don't
The
say.
sages taught in a Baraita. And if a man has committed a sin worthy of death, you shall hang him on a tree. I would have said that they hang him and only afterwards put him to death, the way the Gentile government does, executing the transgression by hanging. And therefore, the verse says that the man has committed a sin worthy of death, he's put to death, and then you hang him. Did we do that? See, if the person is supposed to be killed by hanging, then you can kill him by hanging. So the idea that you put him to death and then hang him on a tree tells you it has to be a death penalty that is not hanging, which is why the rabbis have said this is what you do with somebody who's killed by stoning. They're killed, and then their body is hung. Okay. How so? Can you see my little arrow that I'm moving?
Yes.
Oh, good. So they delay the verdict until it is near sunset, and they conclude the judgment. They put him to death. They hang him, and then they take him right down in order to fulfill the mitzvah of hanging the corpse, but not leaving it up. So they want the execution to happen like right before sunset, so they can do all this quickly, and that he's not hanging up there for any period of time.
Yeah.
Tanu Rabbanan.
Yeah, I don't think we did this. It says
Okay.
familiar.
All right. So this is new. Good. Tanu Rabbanan. Who wants to read this? Go ahead,
Hi.
Bonnie.
The sages taught from the verse, and you shall hang him on a tree. I would derive that the body may be hung either on a tree that has been detached from the ground or on one that is still attached to the ground. Therefore, the verse states, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall bury him that day.
Okay. Hang on, time out. So that makes no sense right away, right? The sages are saying when it says you hang him on an eitz, in Hebrew it's eitz, which could mean either wood or tree. It means both things in Hebrew. So it's either a beam of wood or it's a tree. And they say, well, that's why we have the verse, you shall bury him that day, which doesn't help us answer the question about it being a pole or a tree, right? But go ahead, read the explanation based on the doubled verb.
Based on the doubled verb, it is derived that not only must the transgressor's body be buried, but the tree in which it is hung must also be buried. As the verse employs the same term to instruct that both must be buried, the verse teaches that the corpse must be hung on a tree that has already been detached from the ground and is lacking only burial, just as the corpse is lacking only burial. This serves to exclude hanging the corpse on a tree that is still attached to the ground and is lacking both cutting down and burial.
Okay, so they're going to learn from the Hebrew kavor tikbarenu, which means burying you shall bury, which Hebrew just means, it's a fancy way to say you better do it, but they're not going to take that interpretation. They're going to say that the word to bury is used twice. Kavor means bury, tikbarenu means you shall bury. So because it says bury and bury, it needs to be two different things you're burying. Obviously, one thing you're burying is the body. The other thing you're burying is the eitz, the tree or the piece of wood. And you can't bury a tree that's rooted to the ground. So obviously that has to be something that's been cut down. So obviously now that's a pole. Okay. We've never heard this concept that you need to bury the pole before. That has just shown up for the first time. Go on.
Rabbi Yosef says the tree upon which the corpse is hung is not sunk into the ground. Rather, it is leaned against a wall, as the verse teaches that the tree must be lacking only burial. This serves to exclude hanging the corpse on a tree that is lacking both detachment and burial. And the rabbis say detaching from the ground a tree that had already been cut down and was later sunk back into the ground is nothing. That is, it is an insignificant
All
act.
right. So Rabbi Yossi came in and taught, because it's kavor tikberenu, we know that it cannot be a tree that's in the ground, so it has to be a tree that was cut from the ground that's leaned against the wall. And the rabbis came back in and said, yes, but that thing that has already been cut from the ground, you can actually bury the bottom of that in the ground for stability. And you don't have to worry about the fact that you're not allowed to hang him on something that is not cut from the ground, because it was cut from the ground and then you stuck the pole in the ground and you hung him on it. That's fine. Everyone with me? You understand the concept? Somebody would say, well, if it can't be in the ground, then what if the pole is going to slip? Like,
Yeah, because earlier in 46a, it was leaning.
Right. And so they're saying it's got to be leaning, but it can be stuck a bit in the ground if it's already been cut from the ground. Basically, you could do a telephone pole, right? It's a pole with a crossbar, and you can hang the guy on it. By the way, it said they attach his hands together, and then they put his hands over the top of the pole. So there's no nailing through his hands or anything like that. It's the rope between his wrists that's over the top of the pole. Everyone get the image? Right? So yes, no, maybe so?
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
I'm not understanding. Is the pole supposed?
It's the pole what?
Ron, you're muted.
Sorry, is the pole leaning against the wall or something? I'm not understanding that.
Pole, wall.
Okay, so it does need to lean on a wall.
Yeah, right. For stability, the concept is we're assuming that the eights is not
Okay, Rabbi, I think, did you freeze? Ron, you're muted. Rabbi, you're frozen.
How about your phone?
okay. The source of the potential confusion, am I back?
Yes.
The source of the potential confusion is they've taken the verse kavor tikberenu, and they've interpreted it as the pole upon which he is hung, the wooden pole upon which he is hung, has to be cut from the ground. It can't be an actual living tree because we're supposed to bury it as well. Fine. Everyone seems okay with that. The practical implication now seems to be, can the bottom of that pole be dug into the ground a little bit as it's leaning against the wall for stability, right? Because you don't want the guy sliding down like this or the pole falling over. And the reason you might not want to do that is because maybe that sounds like the bottom of the pole has already been buried before you hung the guy on it, right? And you're supposed to hang him and then bury them both. So if you dig the bottom of the pole into the ground, maybe it's kind of like you're already starting to bury the thing too early. This is a very, very minute logical thing. And obviously the editor of the Gemara is setting us up for something or just having a little fun. Okay? The Mishnah teaches.
The Mishnah teaches, that is to say, were the dead man's corpse to remain hanging, reminding everyone of his transgression, people would ask, for what reason was this one hung? They would be answered, because he blessed God, a euphemism for blasphemy, and the name of heaven would be desecrated. It is taught in a Baraita that Rabbi Meir says, the sages told a parable. To what is this matter comparable? It is comparable to two brothers who were twins and lived in the same city. One was appointed king while the other went out to engage in banditry. The king commanded that his brother be punished, and they hanged his twin brother for his crimes. Anyone who saw the bandit hanging would say, the king was hanged. The king therefore commanded that his brother be taken down, and they took the bandit down. Similarly, people are created in God's image, and therefore God is disgraced when a corpse is hung for a transgression that the person has committed.
Yeah, I think we had that before, but okay. Everyone, this sound familiar to you or not?
No, this sounds new.
Oh, okay, very good. So you understand the parable? We're created in the image of God. Seeing us hang up there would make people, at some point say bad things about God, right? Just like the parable of the identical twins, one becomes a thief, one becomes a king. And when the thief is hung up, everyone says, oh my God, the king has been hung up, right? All right, Mishnah teaches, go ahead.
The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Meir said that the phrase, for he that is hung is a curse of God, should be understood as follows. When a man suffers in the wake of his sin, the divine presence says, I am distressed about my head. I am distressed about my arm. The Gemara asks, from where is this inferred? How does Rabbi Meir understand the word kilelat? Abeya says, when a man is hung after he is put to death, God is like one who said, I am not light, meaning my head is heavy for me, my arm is heavy for me. God is in distress when he has to administer punishment.
Pause. Hang on a second. Okay, so Rabbi Meir says this thing in the Mishnah about God having empathetic suffering, God feeling what the person feels as they suffer. They basically the Gemara is saying, where do you get that from, right? Honestly, because we've never heard anything like that before. And they're saying that Rabbi Meir, who was in the Mishnah saying this, is doing a midrash on the word kelelat, right? Kelelat, right? Kilelat and kelelat and kalalani is all from the Hebrew word kal, which means fast or quick or light in weight. So kal late, the word late means it is not. So if you take the word klilat, which really means a curse, kalal means a curse, but you break it in half and make a pun of kal and late, then it's two new words. And those two new words are light, it is not. So rather than being a curse of God, it's saying it is not light for God, meaning it is heavy for me. It is heavy for me, which they interpret as some kind of a suffering for God, that it's a burden for God that this is happening. And so that's how they say from that concept, God can be understood as suffering with the person. It's a reach. You have to go into punster midrash mode, break the word apart, create the two new words, and then interpret what those two words would mean for God, and then draw the conclusion about God. So it's not like the Torah says God suffers with people, but the rabbis are coming up with that teaching in a beautiful way.
In the Hebrew, I see it as two words. Is it written above as one word?
Okay, so you're here, right? Commander Amar kal late, meaning light it is not. Okay, but if you go back to the Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Meir b'sha'ah adam mitzta'er shechina malashon amart kalani. Okay, so it's this word, kalani, meaning it is a curse for me, or okay, so this is kalani. What does this kalani mean? And that's they're asking, what does it mean? So Rabbi Meir says the phrase is a klelat of God when a man suffers. So we have to go back to the verse. The original verse in Deuteronomy is, his body shall not remain all night on the tree. You shall bury him, for he that is hung is a curse of God. Ki klelat Elohim. Okay, so the original verse said klelat, this word, which means it is a curse of. Rabbi Meir interpreted it as kalani, it hurts me, it distresses me, much less than it is a curse of. And then they come, and then in our portion here, they interpret it as kal late. Did you follow that, Ron?
Yes, I see it now. Thank you.
Okay, so klalet, which meant a curse of, was interpreted by Rabbi Meir as kalani. It is distressful for me. And Rabbi Meir is now being interpreted by the Gemara as saying kal lately. It is not light for me. That's how he got to it being distressful.
The cow knees threw me off a little bit there because this makes sense because you can see it being split, the word, but the cow knee you can't see being split.
So they're having the same problem you're having. They're looking at Rabbi Meir and they're saying, how did he get to that? And now they're interpreting it as saying, well, he's really saying this, which sounds a lot like the original word in the verse. You with me? Yes.
Yes.
When you're muted, I can't hear the marbles rattling when you nod.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so Bonnie, I think we're up to Rava said.
Rava said to him, if so, he should have said explicitly, my head is heavy for me. My arm is heavy for me. Rather, Rava said, when a man is hung after he is put to death, God is like one who said, the world is light for me, meaning I am light and therefore the world is heavy for me and I am in distress.
Okay, so let's try and understand that logical run. So Rava says, okay, the verse said klelat, meaning curse. Rabbi Meir said kalani, meaning it's distressful to me. The interpretation of that is he really means kalatni, it's not light for me. And it would be so much more direct if you would just say, instead of any of that, that it's heavy. Like, why say something's not light? Like, you know, hey, buddy, I want to introduce you to my sister. She wants you to take her out on Saturday night. What's she like? Well, she's not light. Right?
It's no double negative.
Yeah, telling, you know, she's not something, he's not something, it's not something. Why would you do that? Just say what you mean, right? It is. All right. So he says it should say heavy. Rather, Rava said, so what was Rava doing that made him not want to say heavy? He was saying that when a man is hung after he's put to death, God is like one who says, the world is light for me. Ki li alma, alma meaning the world. Keel li alma. So keel is a kind of light in Aramaic. I am light, and therefore the world is heavy for me, and I am in distress. Not good logic and not good grammar. Now we're going to go back to Kalat, which is really the source of the whole problem. Like, how is the man being left up there? It was very clear to begin with. The man being left up there is a curse to God. Klelat Adonai. What's the problem? Oh, Klelat Elohim. Okay, so this word Klelat. Ron, you want to track it for us? You're muted. You don't want to. Okay. Are you saying no?
No, I'm having some problems, and I'm sort of having a little bit of a list because of some dental work.
I gotcha. Okay. So Bonnie will continue.
The Gemara asks, this word kilelat is needed for what it itself teaches, namely that a blasphemer is hung after he has been stoned. How then can it be interpreted as alluding to God's distress at the death of a transgressor?
All right, very good. Pause. Remember where we are. Go back to the original verse. There's my Mishnah. The original verse, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall bury him that day. For he that is hung is a curse of God. Maybe we can interpret that verse differently in its simple words, right? Why? It says, Lo talin nivlato al eitz ki kavor tikbarenu ki klalat Elohim talui. Because a hung person is a curse of God. That could be reinterpreted actually as because the hung person cursed God, right? That it's just explaining why this guy has been hung up there, right? So you could be saying you needed in the original verse an explanation that this guy has been hung, his body does not remain up there, and you shall bury him, for he that hung cursed God rather than is a curse of God, or leaving him is like a curse of God. Maybe it just says he that hung is a curse of God. Klelat Elohim talui. A curse of God is the hung person. So let's go forward and see what that sounds like.
So
Here
now
we
I'm
will.
confused. He
Well,
was hung
the
because he cursed God, or his hanging?
The
Because-
verse in Deuteronomy said, "Don't leave him up all night, because Klelat Elohim talui," which we've been interpreting as a curse of God is hanging. Leaving him up there is like a curse of God. It's offensive to God. That's what we were understanding it as. But maybe we need to completely re-understand those words. Maybe Klelat Elohim talui is just telling us that a hung person, a talui, is done to somebody who was Klelat Elohim, a cursor of God. So they could just say, in the sentence might be ending, don't leave him up all their night, because a hung person is a cursor of God, or a cursor of God is a hung person. In other words, the word Klelat is needed for that which itself teaches that the blasphemer is hung after he's been stoned, because he's a blasphemer. So if Klelat really is coming to tell you that it's the guy who cursed God, and that's an important piece of information in the verse, then you can't go and start interpreting the verse in all these other ways. Because remember, rabbis tell you you can only interpret every word one way. So this is coming in and saying that Klelat Elohim is not available for distress or klalani or kal lately and all the things that we just did. You can't do that because we actually need that word for what it says in its original place. It's not available for interpretation. Okay? So that's what is happening here. So if this word klelat is needed for what itself teaches, that the blasphemer is hung after he's been stoned, how then can it be interpreted as alluding to God's distress? It's not available. We need its other meaning, right?
So
The Gemara answers. Go ahead.
yeah, I'm just trying to understand. Is this the idea that we're made in God's image, and if you keep him up there so long, that is the why it's kehilat, because you're blaspheming God because part of man is in God's image.
I'm going to answer you in a second. What we're doing right now is arguing over the availability of the word klelat for interpretation. If it means what you're saying, Ron, that's fine. That's how I interpreted it when we first read it. That would mean it's not available for other interpretation. That's what it means. Or it might mean an even more literal, less imaginative thing, which is just he's a cursor of God and he gets hung. And that's what the word is needed for in that sentence. He is a cursor of God. Klelat Elohim. He is a cursor of God. So in any event, whether it's your interpretation or the really, really unimaginative, literal, fundamentalist interpretation of the word, in either of those cases, the word's not available for the whole Rabbi Meir thing, right? So now it says, if so, the verse should have stated. Go on.
If so, the verse should have stated, one who curses, mekhalal.
Pause. So if you're going to say that it's not available for interpretation because Klelat Elohim is referring to the person and it says a curse of God, which is what Klelat Elohim means, and you're saying that's the person, you should have said Mikalel Elohim. The person who curses God is Talui. Klelat wouldn't be the right word to really put there. But it's not the best word. So the Gemara is going to say, if it's really meant to mean that, then it would have said this. And since it didn't say this, it doesn't mean that. And now it's available for interpretation again. Right? We've seen this rabbinic logic on Torah verses a lot before. This is what they do. They argue over the availability of a word, which is a way of distracting you from whether or not their interpretation of it makes any sense whatsoever. Right? Ron's got the right interpretation. There's no question in my mind. Ron is reading the Torah correctly. But the rabbis don't want to be limited by that. The rabbis are trying to get to divine empathy as a theology of suffering, right? And Ron's interpretation doesn't get you there. Ron's interpretation just leaves God as the stone-cold lawgiver who never touches you and can't feel what you feel and really doesn't give a damn. right? That's what Ron's interpretation gives you. God, the executioner with no regret, no sympathy, no empathy, no suffering, nothing, right? So they're trying to help us with that. In some ways, this is a very modern sensitivity. They're trying to give us a God who suffers, right? Post-Holocaust theology does that, right? The God of the covenant cannot answer the Holocaust. We have 1.5 million executed children. Does God care? God cares but does nothing? God cares but is impotent to do anything? God is incompetent? God is cruel? What's the answer? What is the way we can come up with any God that makes any sense, right? Well, one of the answers is God hates that. God commanded us not to do that. God suffered with every suffering, murdered child and continues to suffer with us today. Okay, maybe. It's a really modern theology, right? It's not the Aristotelian God who doesn't feel emotions and never changes, right? To feel an emotion and then to not feel an emotion means you undergo some kind of change. So that's what we call process theology, a divine being that is dynamic and continues to grow and change with us over time, right? So the rabbis are really anticipating a very interesting theology of suffering here. Okay, go on. So that was 2 words. I'll try not to interrupt you. The Gemara asks,
Well,
right here.
yeah, what is the meaning? Oh. You want me down there and not skip the other sentence?
Well, we just read this. Okay, fine. What is the meaning?
What is the meaning of kilelat? It serves to teach the statement taught by Rabbi Meir. The Gemara asks, if so, say perhaps that the entire verse comes for this purpose, to underscore the dignity of the transgressor, who was created in God's image, and not to teach the halacha governing a blasphemer. The Gemara responds, if so, the verse should have stated, lightness, kilat. What is the meaning of kilelat? Conclude 2 conclusions from it. Conclude that the blasphemer is hung after he has been stoned, and conclude that God is distressed at the death of a transgressor.
They broke their rule, right? So they said that there's the literal meaning and then there's the interpretive meaning, and you get to have both. The verse didn't say kilat, so it's not going to mean lightness. Instead, it's going to mean what Rabbi Meir said. And the rest of the verse is coming to teach you about what to do with the guy. And this word is coming to teach you about how God feels. So they get away with it, right? All right, the Mishnah teaches. Go on.
The Mishnah teaches that everyone, not only an executed transgressor, must be buried on the day of his death, if that is at all possible. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, excuse me, from where is it derived that one who leaves his deceased relative overnight without burying him transgresses a prohibition? The verse states, but you shall bury him, doubling the verb for emphasis. From here it is derived that one who leaves his deceased relative overnight without burying him transgresses a prohibition.
Okay, so this is a different interpretation of the same verse, which theoretically is supposed to cause us a problem. But the truth is, they're going to take this verse and they're going to run it for a whole bunch of paragraphs. They're going to interpret it a bunch of different ways. Kavor tikbarenu, burying, you shall bury him. So what they're saying is, Rabbi Yochanan is asking in the name of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, how do you know that there's a negative command? Right? I know there's a positive command. You shall bury him. What's the negative command that you shall not? And the you shall not is you shall not leave him overnight. And if you leave him overnight, you're breaking that you shall not command, that negative command. And they get that from the second word, kavor tikbarenu. Kavor is you shall bury him, and tikbarenu is you shall not leave him overnight. Is that what tikbarenu means? No. Okay.
Isn't tikvarenu plural, like we should not do that?
It's you, plural, shall not bury him. The u on the end is the direct object him. Tikbarenu. You're still not unmuting yourself when you talk after your comments.
I'm sorry.
Okay, go on.
The There are those who say that Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, from where in the Torah is there a hint to the mitzvah of burial? The verse states, but you shall bury him, kavor tikbarenu, doubling the verb for emphasis. From here, there is a hint to the mitzvah of burial in the Torah.
Okay, so this is fascinating. First of all, there's an ikata amre. There are some people who say that there is a tradition of Rabbi Yochanan, and that means not everyone agreed that there was a tradition of Rabbi Yochanan. But this tradition of Rabbi Yochanan that some people have is that he called into question whether burial was a Torah command or not. So we know we have this verse, Kavor Tikbarenu. How could Rabbi Yochanan argue that this verse does not teach us that we have to bury people? Think about it. Where in the Torah? I mean, I know in the Torah there's all kinds of places where they do bury people, but it never says you have to. It just says they did it. Right? Mind-blowing, right? So where is the Torah command? You need to bury people. So they're learning it from this, Kavor Tikbarenu. Now you could say, if you want to be a troublemaker, no, Kavor Tikbarenu only applies to people executed by the court. Regular people can rot, but criminals you need to bury. That doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense to me, right? Grandma you can leave on the porch in the rocking chair forever, but mass murderers, they get treated with burial. Makes no sense. But that's what they're saying, is that you've got Kavor Tikbarenu. From here, there's a hint of the mitzvah of burial in the Torah. Go on.
The Gemara.
Now we're going to get stories.
Okay, the Gemara relates, King Shapur, the monarch of Persia, once said to Rav Chama, from where in the Torah is there a hint to the mitzvah of burial? What proof is there that the dead must be buried and not treated in some other manner? Rav Chama was silent and said nothing to him, as he could not find a suitable source. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said, the world has been handed over to the foolish, as Rav Chama should have said to King Shapur that the mitzvah of burial is derived from the verse, but you shall bury him.
Okay, so this is really interesting. All right, because who's ever heard of King Shapur before?
Nope.
All right, so
Never
King
heard of it.
Shapur was a great king of Persia in the 3rd century of the Common Era. So this is early Gemara. And he went from Persia across Babylonia and all the way to Turkey before he got defeated.
Is this
Okay.
before Achashverosh?
Long after.
This is long after Achashverosh.
This is third century of the Common Era, post Mishnah. Okay, so the Mishnah is written in 200. King Shapur becomes king in Persia soon thereafter, and he makes his way all the way across Babylonia to Syria and Turkey, expanding the Persian Empire. The rabbis of the Gemara, and notice it's pretty late in the Gemara discussion, so it's probably not early rabbis, it's late rabbis, right? Hang on.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So later in the Gemara period, later in the Talmudic period, maybe in the 400s, a couple hundred years after King Shapur, they have a legend of King Shapur tweaking, utzing, debating with the rabbis about the law of burial in the Torah. What is the likelihood that King Shapur debated halacha with rabbis? Somewhere between 0 and 0, right? King Shapur did not go to the Talmudic yeshiva in Surah and Pumbedita and sit with the rabbis and study Torah and debate whether burial is in the Torah. Right? That certainly would never have happened. Okay, first of all, there weren't a lot of them yet in the 200s. They were local, they were foreigners, and they were in Babylonia. He's the king of Persia. As he comes through this area, it would have just been as a conqueror moving right along. So this is a later story. reaching back, creating a myth, just like we have stories of Alexander the Great coming to Jerusalem, which never happened. Later rabbis telling stories about a well-known, famous, conquering emperor who stopped by and debated halacha and Torah with the rabbis, ultimately affirming the rabbis' teaching and interpretation. This is a common motif, okay? So, but this is interesting because King Shapur said to Rav Hama, okay, and he says, where is their burial in your Torah? Right? And Rav Hama doesn't answer him. Why does Rav Hama not answer him?
Says he couldn't find a suitable source, but the whole thing looks like an excuse to insult him.
Yeah, he might just be, he might be being wise. I have an answer, but I'm not going to get into it with you because that always goes badly when emperors lose arguments with Jews, right? Emperors don't like to lose arguments with Jews, so I'm not going to give you the argument, right? Maybe. What else? Maybe there's no answer. Maybe it's not in the Torah. Maybe this King Shapur is a chacham, and he's really onto something here. But we know that's not true. The entire rabbinic system is based in thousands of years of devotion to burial in the ground. We know that this can't be true. So Rav Acha Bar Yaakov says, go ahead.
The world has been handed over to the foolish. That's the insult.
Right. So Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, writing later, says, look, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
But he doesn't know the context.
He doesn't know the context, right? Not really, because he's like a fourth generation Amora in Babylonia. He's like later. This is later. And he's saying Rav Chama should have said to King Shapur that the mitzvah of burial is deserved from Kavor Tikbarenu, right?
But he doesn't say that. He just says ki kavor.
It's the same verse, though. He's just quoting a word from it, right? Anyone got a Tanakh in front of them? I have a Goyish Tanakh in front of me. 21:3, right?
Yep.
No, that's the story of the breaking the neck of the cow between the two towns, and the person they found between the towns swears that I didn't do it, you didn't do it, and you shall bury him. So that's the command there. So, okay.
That's a weird quote to use to go back to that one rather than the original one that we're talking about, which is the blasphemer.
Save that spot in your mind, and let's go back to the Mishnah and see where we are. No, it's the same verse. It's the same verse. Kavor Tikbarenu. The Goyish one's got the verses wrong. That's why you don't grab the Bible there. All right. So it is in the same verse. Kavor Tikbarenu. All right. So he's just taking the word kavor as being the command, you shall bury. And then, of course, we had the other guy who said Tikbarenu is the negative command, you shall not leave him unburied. So far that's working with us, okay? King Shapur the Chacham stumped Rav Chama, and Rav Acha Bar Yaakov is just stupefied that Rav Chama didn't know the obvious answer to King Shapur, right? He's like, there's a verse. How can you not know the verse? The world's been given over to stupid people. Okay, Leah Vadle, go ahead.
The Gemara explains, in that case, King Shapur could have replied that the verse merely proves that a coffin should be made for the deceased so that he can be placed in it, Not that the deceased should be buried in the ground, as the verse could be understood as instructing that the corpse be placed in some sort of receptacle, not in the ground. The Gemara challenges, Rav Chama could still have claimed that the mitzvah of burial is derived from the doubled verb, you shall bury him, kavur tikberenu. The Gemara answers, in that case, King Shapur could have replied that he does not learn anything from a doubled verb, which seems to be merely a stylistic choice and not the source of a new halacha.
Okay, notice in this paragraph, there are only 7 Hebrew words. And you have how many English words to explain it?
A lot.
Okay. In other words, the leavad le aron tikberenu lo mashmalan means it says, let them make him a coffin as a burial, but as a burial, it is not taught for him. So it's weird. It's very terse, and the interpreters here have had to kind of play out a flow of logic that makes that very short sentence fragment bring anything to bear that makes any sense. They've probably got it right. Let that a coffin be made for him, but bury him has not been taught. Okay, so that's the objection. King Shapur could have said, Kavor Tikberenu is a single concept, and it means make him a coffin. What's going on here? Why does that make any sense to anyone that Shapur might be saying that, or he would make that argument? Think about a reality, okay? What would a reality be that's really being discussed here? Why would King Shapur be imagined to be having this conversation with the rabbis? If the president of the United States came to the Jewish community and said, why are you burying in the ground? What's behind that?
They need the ground for something else? Not enough ground available?
Or they consider it offensive? Maybe in the dominant culture, putting bodies in the ground is horrific, right? If you're in India and you bury a body in the ground, it's like you're cursing the ground. You need to have a funeral pyre, and you need to cremate and let things go and put the body into the next level of reincarnation and all this stuff. I mean, why would you trap a body to rot in the ground? What a horrible thing to do to someone you love, right? Completely different mindset, different frame of reference, different cultural background. The Persians have very strong beliefs about afterlife and death. And it is not beyond logic to think that the king of Persia would have wanted burial how?
Of ground in a tomb, or?
The mausoleum, right? You walk into the cemetery and there's some people in the ground and you see all these big stone box houses with people's names on them and doors on the front that never open again, right? What's going on there? A lot of them, it's not just that they bought the plot and they built something nice on top of the burial in the ground. A lot of those places, they're buried inside a stone coffin that's sitting inside that little house, right? Think about the King Tut. Right? They didn't just embalm his body and put it in on a shelf. They put it inside that gold sepulcher, that gold coffin with the paint and the face and everything on it, right? So, this is a very interesting conversation. Now it's no longer a troublemaker, King Shapur of Persia. We might actually be having a cultural interchange in this imagination of rabbis centuries later, at the time of, who was it, Acha Bar Yaakov, who's living in the 400s of the Common Era, and saying, you know what? The king Shapur of Persia, when he first met our people in this land, asked, why do you bury? And we said, we're commanded by our God to bury. And he said, really? Quote me a verse. Teach me a teaching. Show me how the God of the universe, who Cyrus of Persia, our ancient hero, blessed your people and honored your people. We care what that God says. Tell me, what did that God say about burial? And the best they've got is, well, when you execute somebody and you hang him on a tree, you can't leave him all night, right? That's a very interesting thing that's going on here. So the second half of it tells me that's really probably what's going on, because he could have said, Kavortik Berenu means put him in a mausoleum. That's really not so stupid. That's actually something that people might have thought burial means, right? So now the Gemara explains, we go back. In the case, King Shapur, so let's go back. The Gemara says to King Shapur once said to Rav Chama, where in the Torah does it say burial? And Rav Chama said nothing. Why? Well, maybe Rav Chama said nothing out of deference to not insult the king, whose family is in a mausoleum somewhere, right? And he just was quiet. Later, Achabar Yaakov, who's whoever he is, was, stupid people. Why didn't he just quote the verse? Easy for you to say, you're not talking to the emperor, right? And they say, well, you know what? You could have quoted the verse, but he could argue that that verse, burial doesn't always mean in the ground. He could have said that. So why would Rav Chama have gotten into it with him, right? So maybe he was smart not to say anything. So, Venema, go on.
The Gemara asks, but let Rav Chama say that the mitzvah to bury the dead is derived from the fact that the righteous forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were all buried. Good.
So you could just take the reality. You know what? True. We have a verse that says you shall bury, and the emperor King Shapur might think burial's in a mausoleum and that's messy. You could just say, you know what? Ever since Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we've been burying in the ground. He bought the cave of Machpelah. He said, I have to bury my dead. This is what we do, right? He could have said that. Go on. But the Gemara answered.
Okay. The Gemara answers, King Shapur could have said that this was merely a custom of the time, but not a mitzvah.
Now why? What's going on here? Now what's happening? Why is it a problem that King Shapur would say it's a minhag? Why is it a problem that we might think it's a minhag? There's legal coercion going on here. King Shapur is trying to stop us from burying in the ground, but presumably he would accept the legitimate ancient tradition if our sacred text tells us we have to do it. And that's not crazy, right? In the ancient world, ancient religions were valued. They were of power. If God had allowed these people to live for 2,000 years by the time they show up in Persia, clearly the gods are favorable towards them, and we should afford them some respect. So you need to tell your, but if it's not there, it's just a minhag, then yeah, I want the right of way, and I'm going to build a mall over there, and we're going to dig up the bodies and stop you from burying anymore, because the government wants to use that land. The government wants to stop you from burying there. But if it's a mitzvah, fine. But if it's a minhag, sorry, we win. It's interesting. Go on.
The Gemara asks, Rav Chama could have derived the mitzvah from the fact that the Holy One, blessed be he, buried Moses, which proved that this is the proper way to handle the dead.
Yeah, I mean, even God buried Moses, his prophet. You want to tell us that we shouldn't behave towards the dead the way our God taught us to behave towards the dead? Go on.
The Gemara answers, King Shapur could still have said that God acted in this manner in order not to deviate from the general custom, but this does not prove that burying the dead is a mitzvah.
Look, in the neighborhood of Mount Nebo, where the children of Israel were when Moses died, it was customary to bury in the ground. God was just going along with the custom of the land so that everybody would be comfortable with how he was dealing with Moses. But if your God had lived under my empire in Persia under King Shapur, your God would never be burying in the ground. He'd be following my customs like a good God should do. Right? So you see that what seemed like a really crazy midrash making up the emperor coming and talking to the rabbis is probably preserving an actual legal conflict that happened between the Persian authorities and the Jewish authorities sometime in the 3rd century of the Common Era. We probably have a real conflict preserved here. Go on. Actually, no, this is a good place to stop.